April 3, 1944. A gravel road outside a crumbling village in northern Italy. The light hit the dust in lines, and the sound was a constant metallic scrape as supply trucks eased by. In the open field, a small tank sat alone like a child left in the middle of a marketplace, a toy among giants. Men in the watchtower laughed into their radios and called it a tin can and a plaything. The lieutenant on the ridge lowered his binoculars and snorted, the sound sharp in the cold air. He had seen heavier machines come and go, and assumed this one would not last a day under fire. Below the light armor and the stubby gun, there was an engineering decision no one at first respected. A decision that traded armor for mobility and simplicity for reliability. They did not know that a certain luck and a stubborn design choice would make this machine survive a direct hit and return with a scar that would rewrite how close support was thought of by commanders. Engines matter, they thought then, and later they would learn why. The choice of a rugged, air-cooled engine and a simplified suspension could be decisive. In the next minutes, those who laughed would taste silence, and then a different sound, the kind of metallic groan that announces unexpected endurance. To understand why this small vehicle came back from a blast, we have to go back to the factory, to the engineer who insisted on small parts, and to the crews who dared to drive it into the teeth of fire. The first reactions were small and casual, like the toss of a cigarette butt. From the observation post on the ridge, radio voices carried a tone of amused scorn. "It looks like a toy," one voice said. "Bring your child in a picnic," another joked. The map in the lieutenant's hands showed no major objective nearby, just a supply route and the occasional strafing run by fighters. Pilots who flew close support had different words. In a mess tent, a pilot named Oleg had once muttered under his breath, "They call it fragile because it does not follow their assumptions," and tapped the side of his P-47 model, where Pratt & Whitney engines throbbed with unspent power. The perception that small equals weak was a recurring mistake across theaters. Initial reports listed the model as low weight, low armor, and insufficient armament for sustained frontline use. Statistical summaries looked neat on paper. Numbers of vehicles lost per month, rate of part failure, fuel consumption. The tone was confident and dismissive. What the numbers did not show were the small design compromises that allowed a vehicle to be repaired with fewer parts in the field. The fact that drop tanks and simple wheel assemblies could be cannibalized. And the human factor, the way a crew would improvise repairs with nothing but a hammer and a prayer. Commanders who viewed the light tank only as a logistic nuisance missed the way volume, fire, and aircraft escort could turn what looked like a toy into a blunt instrument. The misread would cause surprise and force a tactical rethink. The design table where the light tank was born was a small room with blueprints pinned to the walls and coffee rings circling technical notes. The lead designer, Elias Hayes, smoked and paced and kept repeating a single phrase, "Keep it simple, keep it reliable." His profile in reports was terse. He had been a mechanic in the Great War and later an engineer who preferred air-cooled engines and standardized parts. He argued for a suspension that used fewer moving parts, for armor that could be salvaged easily, and for a turret that did not require precision machining. In meetings, he clashed with staff officers who wanted thicker plating and more powerful guns, and with armament specialists who pushed for heavier calibers. Elias wanted a compact engine that could run on low-grade fuel and a gearbox that could be repaired beside the road. The design choice to use robust riveted plates rather than welded monocoque was derided by some as archaic, yet it meant field repairs could be done with a rivet gun and a simple template. He insisted on a small radial engine that borrowed lessons from contemporary aircraft, Pratt & Whitney units known for tolerance of damage and ease of maintenance. Test pilots and drivers ran trials over muddy courses. At first, the vehicle rolled and vibrated and broke parts with disappointing frequency. But tweaks to the paddles of the drive sprockets and to the track tensioning system reduced failures. A model that began as a compromise emerged as a philosophy of redundancy. Field officers initially saw only the silhouette and dismissed it. Those who watched the trials noted the engine cough, then settle the way a throat clears before a shout, and began to suspect there was method in the minimalism. The technical notes contained numbers that mattered: the torque curve of the radial engine, the simplified convergences of the steering arms, the rate at which the suspension soaked impacts and returned to baseline. These would later explain why the machine could take a blow and still move. Training with the new tank was a blunt schooling in humility. The training ground smelled of oil and clay, the taste of cold coffee lingered in the mouths of recruits, and the metal smell of hot brakes rose in the air. New crews spent weeks learning to accept simple controls and to perform modular repairs under time pressure. Sergeant Maria Ruiz ran the mechanical school and was unyielding with her whistle and her list of tasks. "Struck the final drive now," she barked, and hands moved like choreography around greasy axles. Corporal Anders and Private Levin argued over torque settings and over the correct way to wedge a broken track back into place. The drills were pragmatic, a constant alternation between doing and fixing. And the voices were a chorus of precise commands. One afternoon, a simulated mine blast overturned a training vehicle. The men felt the ground fold and then smelled burning rubber and oil. And for a moment, the world narrowed to the taste of iron at the back of the throat. The crew extracted themselves with frantic hands, splinters of wood in their palms, and a new respect for rapid jerry-rigging. In a quiet moment, Lieutenant Crawford called the crews together and told them stories of earlier conflicts where heavier armor did not win because it could not be replaced. The backstory of the protagonist, Captain Thomas Ellis, is rooted in these ranks. He grew up in a town of machinists watching fathers bend metal at night in arc lights. He learned to strip an engine by age 12 and to barter parts in a market where shortages were normal. He joined the service because he believed machinery and men were a single equation. In youth, he had raced a motorcycle down dirt roads, once losing a friend to a crash, and memorized that loss like a lesson about fragile bodies and resilient tools. His training in the Armored Corps was competent but not spectacular, and he was known for improvisation rather than doctrine. When he lost his brother in an air raid, the moment changed him from a man who wanted rules into a man who trusted adaptability. In the present, he was stubborn, calm, and fiercely loyal to his crew, and to the notion that a vehicle does not end when it is punctured if the crew has the will to keep it moving. The first significant engagement came on a gray morning with low cloud and the staccato of distant artillery like someone shaking a metal sheet far away. The light tank and a handful of similar vehicles were escorting a convoy when the enemy appeared, not in grand formations, but in a precise, concentrated strike. Fighter ground attack aircraft swooped, and then a single larger bomber released a shaped charge that found the convoy column. The reports that followed were terse and chaotic, the noise of radio static a backdrop to shouted orders. There is a moment in battle when perception shifts and silence becomes a prelude to action. Captain Ellis was in the command seat, feeling the small machine shudder as the first bomb left a crater and the smell of cordite and dust filled the cabin. Outside, the metal tasted of sparks as tracer rounds stitched the air and the smell of singed fabric layered over the earth. The crew exchanged short-clipped phrases that would later be transcribed into reports. "We are hit," said Private Levin. "Armor breached front right," replied Corporal Anders. "Punch controls, keep her moving," Ellis said. "Oleg, call for close air support," the radio operator yelled. "Not enough time," came back a voice on the net. This scene contained direct human choices in the way only combat can produce. The tank took the brunt of a shaped charge that punched through the lower plate. The blast rolled the vehicle and threw the loader against a rack. The immediate sensory register was brutal: bright flash, deafening concussion, splinters of metal biting into palms. Then a second silence where the men smelled their own sweat and the heavy sweat of burning grease. Miraculously, the radial engine coughed and turned over. The simple gearbox engaged, and the vehicle limped forward. The design choices reappeared as saving factors: the open louvers that allowed hot gases to vent, and the redundant fuel lines that prevented fire propagation. In the midst of confusion, Captain Ellis ordered a withdrawal and a laydown of suppressive fire. The crew kept firing and moving, and improvised a temporary patch using a steel strip and wire from a radio mast. The detail of the repair would later be a small legend among repair crews. Wounded, the loader kept working because the controls were not complex, and the gun would not jam. The objective had changed from holding ground to survival, and to delivering the crew to extraction. When the vehicle reached friendly lines, the men crawled out, and the sight of the scarred hull with a clean hole and a ring of blued metal became an object of stunned silence. This first proof was the moment the skeptics changed registers to something like curiosity. Word spread among pilots and ground crews that a small tank had taken a shaped charge and still returned. A pilot named Johnson later recounted an encounter mid-sortie, and his voice in the interview retained a blend of awe and professional envy. Johnson's plane had watched the convoy burn and later observed the limping machine cross a ruined bridge, and the image stuck. The proof came not only from eyewitness accounts, but from material evidence: a torn plate archived in a forward workshop, and later a report from a forensics team analyzing the blast pattern. The shell had entered at a shallow angle, and the riveted plates had absorbed and redistributed shock in a way unpredicted by some modeling. The sensory details of the salvage were recorded: the smell of burnt rubber, the sound of tinny clanging as the workmen pried a buckle, the dust that rose when the hull was shored up. The encounter became a small fable among men who saw equipment as a partner, not an extension. It also forced a technical reading of how mobility and simplicity could trump thickness of armor under certain tactical conditions, particularly in terrain where heavy tanks could not operate. Tactics changed after a series of after-action debriefs where pilots and commanders argued over doctrine. The old ways of pairing heavy armor with fighter cover gave way to experiments pairing lighter, faster tanks with close air support, using fighters familiar with boom and zoom attacks. The doctrine emphasized speed of repair, the ability to disperse, and the use of drop tanks not for aircraft, but as temporary fuel stores for ground vehicles to extend range. Testimonials from men like Major Crawford and Technician Maria Ruiz emphasized the new rules: stay mobile, do not fight where a heavy tank would be cornered, and use aircraft suppression to disrupt incoming formations. Comparisons with enemy doctrine showed that the opposing force relied on heavier armor and concentrated anti-tank guns, often positioned to deal with frontal assaults, whereas the new approach exploited cross-country mobility and shortened logistical tails. The language in the briefings turned technical terms into commands. Torque and convergence became tactical markers, just as armament lists and Browning 50 assemblies and ammunition feeds became part of mission planning. The men practiced maneuvers that matched airstrikes: the timing of a P-47 sprinting to altitude with Pratt & Whitney's roar, and then falling in to deliver strafing runs before a tank column moved through a gap. The proof of concept was an operation where a squadron of light tanks punched a supply corridor and then dispersed before counter-artillery could mass. The sensory record of those drills included the smell of hot air after rocket fire, the taste of grit in mouths after dust clouds, the sight of tiny black puffs where anti-tank rounds impacted, and the sound of metal on metal as crews patched hulls on the move. Improvements in scaled production followed. Factories retooled and the numbers began to matter. Sheets of production reports recorded an increase in monthly output and a reallocation of resources toward the light vehicle program. Paddles on drive sprockets were strengthened, the engine intake was given a simple filter designed to capture sand, and a minor change to the turret ring allowed replacement of the gun mount in the field in less than an hour. Production data showed a surge in parts stamped with simple part numbers, and units shifted to a philosophy of interchangeability. The armament was standardized to include machine guns and a light cannon that could fire high explosive and armor-piercing rounds, and ammunition trains were reorganized to favor volume of sorties over single-shot lethality. Strategic effects followed as these machines could be flown to forward airfields, dismantled in crates, and trucked into difficult terrain. Examples included a support mission during a crossing where light tanks provided direct cover for engineers removing mines, and in another case, the vehicles were used to suppress a railway station long enough for demolition teams to remove tracks. The operational metrics were simple: more sorties, fewer downtime hours, higher repair turn rates. Commanders began to consider the cost-benefit, and during a large-scale operation called Kabul, the light tanks provided a tempo of operations that heavy formations could not match, undermining supply lines and forcing the enemy to disperse. The factory footage of workers with grease on their faces, the clank of press machinery, and the smell of hot metal in assembly halls became a new kind of propaganda for morale and for the argument that production in volume created battlefield effects that single engineering superiority could not. Counterattacks from the enemy took predictable and then surprising forms. As news of the machine that survived a direct hit circulated, the enemy deployed jets to test close air support capabilities and to try to deny airspace. Encounters with early jets were violent and introduced new variables. Pilots reported a sound unfamiliar, a high, thin shriek followed by sudden changes in engagement envelope. Skirmishes with those aircraft required integration of ground-based anti-aircraft batteries and the use of smokescreens to hide movements. There were also special operations teams who attempted to sabotage supply depots and specific workshops producing spare parts. In one notorious operation, the enemy staged a massed attack at dawn, intending to overwhelm concentrated production with a single blow. The light tanks were dispersed into small mobile groups and used decoys built from crates and canvas to confuse aerial reconnaissance. The result was that when the main attack came, the enemy jets engaged decoys and expended ordnance ineffectively. Reports of these nights contained close sensory detail: the acrid bite of magnesium flares, the wet slap of condensation on canvas bodies, and the tinny sound of radios trying to coordinate under jamming. Yet limits remained. The machine could not take a frontal hit from a heavy anti-tank weapon without catastrophic damage. And when jets learned to prioritize tracks and suspension, they could immobilize vehicles and leave crews stranded. The ongoing cat and mouse produced incremental adaptations: a better track shoe, a field mending kit, and an improved protocol for leapfrogging convoys under air cover. Moments of tension in this story are sharp and intimate. One stands out when a maintenance crew worked under shelling to patch the final drive, and the leader recalled his brother, a phrase of private memory, and a decision to stay and finish rather than flee. The paragraph of that memory carries the smell of smoke and the taste of blood on cracked lips and the metal chant of hammer on plate. Another moment came when a pilot named Johnson watched as a limping tank crossed a bridge, and he chose whether to call in heavy ordnance or to risk close support. He chose close support, and the decision teetered between guilt and relief. A third moment occurred when a field jury removed the damaged engine, and the crew had to decide whether to scuttle or to cannibalize parts, a choice that measured hope against pragmatism. Each of these moments held a small private calculus of fear and duty, and they shaped decisions that rippled across operations. Viral moments spread and became stories told in bars and mess halls with sensory detail and awe. The first viral image was the comment of scorn when enemy troops saw the light tank for the first time and laughed, calling it a toy. That snide reaction turned into shock and then into fear. The description emphasizes the way laughter became. Silence the roundness of the hull like a toy car in a child's story now pitted with lead. The second viral scene is the one where Johnson watched the limping machine return after a direct hit and is a longer core account. Johnson described the sky as a dull pewter skin and the tank as a moving hurt that still held its course against flickers of flame. The roar of his engine matched the labor of the tank, and the smell of burnt fabric rose like a flag everyone on the sortie remembered. He said he could not stop watching, and that watching changed what he believed a machine could endure. The third viral episode is the demonstration of concentrated firepower when a group of light tanks using converged machine guns and the light cannon stopped a fast armored patrol in its tracks. The effect was brutal and immediate. The sound of metal shredding armor, the shower of sparks, and the wet thud as engines died. The image of a single patrol simply collapsing under a wall of coordinated fire created shock. The fourth viral point was the way production numbers mounted and how that sheer volume replaced losses in ways that frustrated the enemy. The clatter of conveyor belts and the flood of crates became a new kind of assault. The fifth viral crescendo was the later citation by an enemy commander who admitted miscalculation. That admission sealed the narrative. The enemy voice saying we underestimated them was a line that moved men and strategists alike. At the 1/3 mark of this narrative, we pause and ask you to weigh in. You have read about a machine first laughed at and later feared, and about men who improvised and adapted. Which single decision do you think mattered most in that first engagement? Was it the engine choosing a radial engine, or the captain ordering withdrawal, or the pilot Johnson choosing close support? Reply with engine choice, evacuation order, or close support to make your pick. Your comment helps decide which mystery we explore next and informs future episodes where we will dig into documents and interviews. Join the discussion and share what surprised you the most, the practical detail or the human stubbornness that kept men operating under fire. Your engagement steers the next deep dive into reports and archived testimony and might even shape which interview we secure next. Now we return to the factory and to the dry facts that reveal why those choices mattered. Detailed technical passages explain the saving features that allowed survival. The radial engine used a simple air-cooled design that tolerated partial exposure without immediate seizure, and its torque curve delivered usable power at lower RPM, which matters when a vehicle must crawl out of a kill zone. Cooling louvers and redundant oil lines prevented a single puncture from becoming an engine conflagration. The suspension used fewer moving points of articulation, which reduced breakage in rocky terrain and allowed damaged sections to be replaced by adjacent crews with spares. The turret ring employed a standard bolt pattern, and the cannon feed used a modular clip rather than a continuous feed, so a damaged feed mechanism could be swapped in minutes. Maintenance procedures emphasized quick field diagnosis, a checklist that pointed to the most common failures, and a standard kit that included items like a rivet gun, a spare prop shaft, and a simple canvas patch for fuel lines. On the battlefield, these procedures meant that stopped vehicles were unlikely to stay silent for long. Technical documentation recorded test bench cycles and repair times, and these numbers translated into operational uptime. For instance, field engineers recorded that a wheel assembly replaced with a basic toolkit took on average 45 minutes, and that the simplified gearbox reduced catastrophic failures by a significant percentage. The ability to cannibalize parts from damaged vehicles and to scavenge material from captured depots turned scarcity into a tactical resource. There were named individuals whose actions shaped events. Captain Thomas Ellis led his crew with a mix of experience and improvisation. Sergeant Maria Ruiz ran field maintenance and taught crews to perform rapid jury rigs. Lieutenant Johnson was the pilot who watched the limping tank and later testified. Engineer Elias Hayes designed the initial plan and later argued for the replication of parts. Major Crawford organized tactics that matched air cover with mobile armor. Corporal Anders patched tracks under fire. Private Levin tended gunners and kept logs. Dr. Fisher headed the forensic analysis that confirmed blast patterns. Each of these people appears in accounts, and each had a concrete action. Ellis ordering a move, Ruiz teaching a repair, Hayes altering a part, Crawford writing the tactical note, Johnson calling in support, Anders holding a line, Levin recording damage, Fisher dissecting a hull. Together, they formed a network of decisions and actions that made survival possible. The evolution of doctrine saw air-ground integration formalized. Close air support calls adopted purpose-built codes, and the timing of fighter strafing and rocket runs was synchronized to tank columns using pre-arranged windows. The boom and zoom technique of fighters complemented the mobile armor by hitting anti-tank emplacements and then climbing back to altitude to avoid return fire. The integration emphasized the use of drop tanks as temporary fuel stores and the assignment of sorties not as single events, but as linked sequences, ensuring that armored columns had intermittent gear rather than nothing. The tactical manuals were updated to instruct crews on how to use cover and to coordinate with forward air controllers who used precise convergences to limit collateral damage. Comparisons with enemy tactics showed how concentration and weight were still valuable, but could be offset by distributed mobility and sustained tempo. Countermeasures from the enemy grew more sophisticated. Jets learned to focus on tracks and suspension, and artillery adapted to mimic shaped charge effects. Special operations targeted supply chains, and a cycle of adaptation and counter-adaptation unfolded. The battlefields changed in tone, with more camouflage, more night movement, and greater emphasis on preserving force rather than decisive collision. The light tank concept persisted because of a continuing belief among planners that flexibility could produce strategic advantages in varied terrain. Final numbers and a reflection closed the account. Production tallies listed hundreds of units produced within months, with spare part kits multiplied accordingly. Sortie rates and repair times improved, and the metrics showed a clear uptick in operational hours per unit. The human cost remained real, and men like Private Levin and Corporal Anders would carry scars both visible and invisible. The record includes the admission of a hostile commander who later stated on the record, "We underestimated the resilience of their machines," and that line became a closing testament to the change in perception. Strategically, the story teaches a lesson about the marriage of technology and logistics, that victory often demands machine reliability scaled into numbers and applied with doctrine. 1 month after the incident, units reorganized routes and practice runs increased with new timing protocols to sync with fighter sorties. 3 months later, production had adjusted and spare parts flowed more quickly, reducing repair times noticeably. 6 months later, the doctrine had been codified in a field manual, and other theaters began to adopt similar pairings of mobile light armor and air support. The human aftermath was mixed. Crews received commendations, and some men returned to civilian lives, while others remained to teach the next wave of recruits. The legacy is a reminder that what may look like a toy is often an experiment in resilience, and that under fire, small design choices and determined crews can reshape outcomes. If this episode moved you, leave a comment with your pick for the decisive choice, and subscribe for more deep dives into tactical adaptation, technical detail, and the human stories behind machines. Remember the scarred hull that came back across the bridge? It was more than a piece of metal. It was proof that endurance sometimes wears a small face, and the sound of that endurance is a quiet grinding that few forget.